everybody, and welcome to my talk, Life Before the Death of the Landscape, The Submerged World of the Solent. My name is Rebecca Ferriera and I'm a PhD student at the University of Southampton and the University of Reading. Just before I get started with the talk, I just thought it would be really good to introduce who I am, where I've come from. I actually did my undergraduate at the University of Southampton in 2013 and carried on to do a maritime archaeology master's. At the time, I'd actually was really scared about going back into the real world, and so I kind of panicked and applied for the maritime archaeology master's and kind of got to a point of being like, well, I guess I'm gonna have to like ships now. I'm gonna actually have to be interested in ships. But I very quickly realised that actually it gave me the opportunity to do something I'd always been interested in, but never thought I could actually do. So I was very passionate about the Mesolithic throughout my undergraduate, but doing the maritime archaeology masters allowed me to start working with submerged landscapes. And so I ended up doing a part-time master's, and once I finished that, I decided to take a break before doing a PhD and went to work as an offshore archaeology consultant for lots of offshore developments. So I've worked in the North Sea, the Irish Sea, and the English Channel. So what is my research? Well, I specifically look at the Mesolithic period, and this is a time period which is circa around 11,700 to 6,000 years ago, but I specifically work in the earlier part of this period, which is from 11,700 BP all the way through to 8,000 BP, so just prior to that inundation where we see the sea level rise. And as you can just see, I've got a timeline. It can be quite abstract when you're talking about these however many thousands years ago, so I thought it'd be easier to include a timeline. And you can see on the timeline, the smaller increments, they represent 1,000 years ago, each going in there, and you can see along the top 5,000 year increments marked there. But yeah, just where you see that orange circle, that's the Mesolithic. So that's a 6,000 year period. And this is pretty much equal to what we see the beginning of the Mesolithic all the way through to now. It's the same amount of time. So it's quite a large time frame that we're dealing with. Not as big as a Paleolithic, that's huge, but still quite substantial. So when we're dealing with submerged landscapes, we are talking a lot about climate change and environmental impact. But what I really want to do with my PhD is really look at the lifeways of the people that would have lived in these landscapes, and necessarily how they would have maybe adapted to the changes that were happening around them. But more just trying to understand the social aspects. They weren't just, you know, hunting and surviving. They were thriving in these landscapes. So that's kind of, you know, the reason that I'm doing the research I am. So throughout human prehistory, there has been significant climate change at multiple points along this timeline. We've seen colder periods, these are known as the Ice Ages. We also see warmer periods, such as the current Holocene epoch that we currently live in. So the most current one, beginning of the Mesolithic, we see this climatic amelioration. We see it start to warm up, and we start to see the end of the last glacial maximum with the glaciers melting. And you can see with this graph that I've got on the slide, temperature reconstruction just along the bottom, along the horizontal axis, you can see the thousands of years BP, and along the vertical axis, you can see the temperature increase. And it starts from just the end of that last glacial maximum, going from 12,000 BP, and you can see that sharp but then steady increase in the temperature. And the orange circle, this is representing the Mesolithic time period, so the entire period, and then this red circle, that just represents the earlier Mesolithic, so the period that I deal with myself. So with the increase in temperature, we actually also see an increase in the sea level, because when the temperature warms, the glaciers start melting, all the water that was locked up in these ice sheets starts to cause the sea level to rise. And you can see again on the graph that I've got on the screen, again starting with 12,000 BP, you can see the thousands of years BP again along the bottom, and the mean sea level on the vertical axis. But you can see the correlation of that steady but quite steep incline going from 12,000 BP up until the Holocene climatic optimum. And what this really did, so when we start to see the rise in sea level, you get all these lowlands being inundated, the areas being drowned, and you can see with the graphic that I've got on the board right now, you can see this. I've specifically chosen to include three 3 freeze frames that represent the Mesolithic period, so 11,000 BP all the way through to 7,000 BP. And you can see all the lowland areas, those green areas are all the areas that started to be inundated at the beginning of the Mesolithic, at the middle of the Mesolithic. We always talk, when we see graphics like this and we talk about climate change, we talk all the time about submergence, inundation, and about loss. But it was more than that. It wasn't just that we were losing these landscapes. These landscapes were changing and they were evolving. And what I've talked about is that I'm really interested in understanding at a human level how they may have been responding to these changes. We're dealing in a time period where we're talking about hunter-gatherers. They would have been quite in tune with their environments. They definitely would have noticed changes to the sea level. And this, we always see with these kind of maps, you see the changes to the coastline. But with the increase in sea level, we also start to see a change in the water table. So this would have affected onshore, further inland, upland areas in the Mesolithic, and that's why we do get a lot of these wetlands and these marshlands in the Mesolithic. And you know, everybody has this image in their mind of disaster, of these people being like, oh, there's a great wave, let's run for the hills. But actually, it would have been much more nuanced and much more chilled out than that. It would have been, certainly would have been catastrophic events, but not for the most part. It would have been quite gradual. So now I've talked about you know, the reasons that we have the sea level change and this increase in temperature. I'm now just going to talk a bit more, how do we know this as archaeologists? Like, what is the evidence that we have that suggested this? Well, one of the most obvious ones is that we still have remnants of these past landscapes in the intertidal zone at low tide. You might have been out on a walk and you might have seen something that looked interesting, a feature on the beach that looked interesting. A lot of the time these would have been either submerged forests. You could see there's a lot of submerged forests all across the British coastline, but also maybe even features such as trackways. So just on the right here, you can see this is Cadlin Causeway in the Western Solent, and it's been dated from the Neolithic through the Bronze Age. So you do see these things. It might be interesting, but not a lot of people really know what they mean or what they represent. But this is showing that there has been change with the landscape, that the sea level has risen from previous times. One of the most important ones that has been really important for quite a few centuries now is submerged forests. And we even have the earliest recorded reference in 1191 by Gerard of Wales, and he talks about these ancient groves of trees in kind of the pathway of the ships. And it's a really interesting excerpt from his writings, because he's talking about it as possibly being from the deluge, from the biblical flood. And we see a lot of reference to this with submerged forests, with Noah's flood. But it is interesting because he talks not only about the deluge, but acknowledges that this was actually quite deep time. And there's kind of a suggestion that maybe it's a deeper than biblical time kind of thing, as we come to understand more in the 19th century. It wasn't just this stuff in the intertidal zone. We were also seeing this collecting mania happening in the 19th century. Trawlermen going out, pulling up their fishing nets in the North Sea and finding a lot of faunal remains, a lot of remains of elephants and rhinoceros or mammoths, a lot of animals that definitely couldn't have existed in the current climate that we had. So there was this very definite understanding that the land must have extended out some point previously in history. And this is an important time for archaeology because, as I was talking about, a lot of this stuff was kind of delegated to being because of the Noah's flood. But this is also where we start to see the publication in 1859 of Charles Darwin, Origin of Species. And so we start to get a more deeper understanding of prehistory and of deeper time. But the seminal publication that everybody talks about when it comes to submerged forests is Submerged Forests by Clement Reid. He was actually talking about submerged forests and ancient landscapes way before the publication in 1913. He was talking about this stuff at the end of the 19th century. However, this was seminal because it was the first publication that actually addressed these ancient landscapes explicitly. But he did figure these landscapes as something of more of a migratory passage from the continent to mainland Britain. It was more of a land bridge than a lived-in landscape. But interestingly, in the same year, we also have a guy who's not really talked about as much, but was also talking about this stuff, is Robert Munro. based at the University of Edinburgh. He published Prehistoric Britain in 1913, and he starts to talk about these landscapes, but he figures it in a more archaeological sense and actually says, these were the happy hunting grounds of our forefathers. So we do start to see a suggestion that there was something a bit more interesting. It wasn't just about the environmental remains, that there might be actually something archaeologically happening there. This kind of, we had the trawled remains, we had submerged forests, we have a lot of this environmental evidence, but we didn't really have much in the way of direct archaeological finds. But this all changed in 1932 with the discovery of the Colinda harpoon, and you can see the picture on screen now. It's about 20 centimetres in length, and you can see the reconstruction at the top, so it would have been a fishing spear. And this was a really interesting find. This was brought up by a trawlerman who was trawling in the area between the Leyman and Owl Banks, which is about 40 kilometres offshore of the coast of Norfolk. And when he pulled up this block of peat, it broke apart on the deck, and it revealed this beautiful bone point that was obviously humanly modified. And this kind of changed the game, because this was the first direct evidence that we had in the offshore zone that there was something, that there was human occupation or human presence in these landscapes. It wasn't just animals, and it maybe wasn't just a migratory passage. And in 1933, Godwin and Godwin decided to go out with the trawlermen to get a sample of this peat to try and understand the environment that this was found in. And this is because they were seeing a lot of stuff on the East Coast, similar artefacts on the East Coast of Britain at Skipsea, but also stuff in Scandinavia. We saw a lot of this stuff happening in Scandinavia. And once they got the sample, they actually found that there were remains of birch, pine, alder, hazel and willow trees, which is representative of quite a boreal landscape. So this is placing it more in the Mesolithic. And they eventually were able to date this to about circa 12,000 GSBP, which is just at the beginning of the Mesolithic, at that early Holocene stage. So after the discovery of the Colinda harpoon, we don't really see this being talked about too much in the archaeological publications. We have Graham Clark, who excavated Starcar. He was talking about the Colinda harpoon and the continental connections that it had from Scandinavia through to Starcar, because you're seeing similar material. And he worked a lot with the Godwins on this, but it was never really expanded upon, and a lot of the ways that he talked about the landscape was still like it was just this stale, desolate landscape that just had people moving through it A to B. It wasn't really figured in necessarily an important way. And this all really changed only in 1998, where we see another seminal publication from Bryony Coles, when she published Doggerland, a Speculative Survey. And this was very important because this was the first time that we start to see, at least in Britain, someone talking about these landscapes as something more than a land bridge, as being social spaces that people lived and thrived in. And she created a series of really beautiful maps showing the progression, the landscape evolution from the Ice Age all the way through to the Holocene. And you can see one of these maps on the screen now. And this spearheaded a lot of the work that started to come out of the University of Bradford in the early 2000s with Gaffney et al. And the large-scale geophysical mapping of the North Sea paleo landscapes. This was a hugely important project because they were using commercial data. This had never really been done to the same scale in archaeology. They were using data from the oil and gas industry to topographically map these areas, to note areas where they believed paleo channels or lakes to be from these relic landscapes. But the only problem that really came from this project was that it wasn't really calibrated data. It was quite uncalibrated in that there was only a couple of cores that were confirming what they were seeing in the geophysical mapping. But in more recent years, this project evolved into a new project known as the Europe's Lost Frontiers project, where they've started doing calibration survey campaigns. So the most recent one being of the Brown Bank in the North Sea, and you can see that on screen now. The Brown Bank is just a really lovely ridge, topographical ridge in the North Sea that a lot of the archaeology was coming out of. So we didn't have too much archaeology, but that's where we saw a lot of archaeology being brought up and trawled up from. And this really helped to kind of ground truth what we were seeing. So you could see in the cores, you can see the marine inundation, and you can see the old paleo channel through that way. So now I've talked about, the background to all of this stuff, you might start to be getting a sense of you know, the importance of these landscapes. But if not, I'll just kind of reiterate a few of those now. So you can see from the graphics that I was showing, this is huge areas of land that was eventually lost to the inundation. So you can only start to imagine how much archaeology we're really missing. And when we're dealing with prehistory, it's already quite a fragmentary record. We don't have a lot, especially in Britain, we don't really have a lot of the more rare organic finds. And these are the kind of finds that might have better potential to be preserved in offshore zones. So if we start to ignore these spaces and we just completely decide, okay, no, it's too awkward, it's too much work to do, what we're really doing is kind of rejecting a huge amount of archaeology. And when we're dealing with the Mesolithic, the current sites that we have and the known areas that we have, particularly Starkar, things that, while brilliant, they're not representative of the Mesolithic record. We still have quite a weird skew where the northern sites get a lot more attention and a lot more time, and there isn't as much understanding of what's going on in the south, particularly. And this is something that these submerged landscapes might start to help us unlock. So we need to start really working in these unknown spaces, really, just to increase the archaeology, the archaeological knowledge that we have of the time period. But this is all needing to happen quite soon. This is not something that we can keep talking about the potential, and the reason is because it's a finite resource. When we're working in the offshore zone, we're working with a lot of high energy environments. We deal with currents, with coastal erosion. The Maritime Archaeology Trust even noted up to 4 meters of lateral erosion in the northwest Solent. So you can only start to imagine how much we might be losing, or we're losing that context at least. It's great that we might have these ex situ kind of finds being found on the seabed, but it doesn't really do much in way of understanding what was really going on if we don't have these sites in situ. So now that I've talked a lot about the North Sea, I'm going to bring it all back to the Solent properly, because this is what it's about, the submerged world of the Solent. So we've had, again, we've had the similar finds like submerged forests and peat deposits, environmental archaeology happening in this area for quite a while. In the late 19th century, we already had people talking about the sea level rise and the post-glacial inundation of the estuarine system in the Solent. So people like William Fox in 1862 and James Geiger in 1881. And James Geiger's really important publication, because actually he was a paleoenvironmentalist and a geologist, but he was the first person that started to try to draw evidence, even from archaeology, all different types of evidence, to really start to understand what was happening, not just from one view, from multiple perspectives. And it's also interesting considering that he was at the University of Edinburgh at the same time as Robert Munro, so then you start to see this kind of mindset happening with both of these academics placed in the same department. And you can just see, I've included a picture here of Wootton Quall on the Isle of Wight, so you can see these intertidal peats and submerged forests. So if you ever do see something like this, take pictures, send it to Citizen, send it to the Trust, get someone to identify it, or just do a little bit of research. You might be surprised what you find, you never know. But we also have a lot of these peat deposits, and you can see with the map that I've got on the screen right now, HE, Historic England, pulled together the peat database. So you can see all these dots on these maps. These all represent places where they found peats. Not necessarily all Mesolithic peats. These are from all the way from Paleolithic through to the Bronze Age. So we're seeing great time depth for archaeology. But we already have this resource at hand. So we can, there's already quite a lot to deal with if we're just looking at the environmental archaeology in the Solent with these peat records and these submerged forests. But one of the most important things about the Solent is that we've had a lot more trawling up of artefacts off of the seabed by Yarmouth fishermen, which I have affectionately named the Peat Fleet. It was a long day when I made the slide and I thought it was really funny. May not be so funny now, but I will explain why I named them the Peat Fleet in just a minute. But in 1985, Mike Jones, who was a Yarmouth fisherman, went out with his trawlerman, My Pat, and was pulling up more and more of this material, and he decided to get in touch with David Tomlin, an archaeologist based in the Isle of Wight, who then decided to go and monitor what was coming up in these nets. And it was really interesting. We're starting to see a lot of archaeology, not just from the Mesolithic period, but from the Paleolithic through to the Bronze Age as well. So you're seeing similar kind of timeframes as we have with the peat as well. And then a few more Yarmouth fishermen got involved, like Andy Butler. And a really important one is Michael White, who has produced a huge collection of archaeology. And you can see some of the examples on screen. So just on the left there, we have a blade core, and in the middle, we have something known as a tranchette axe, and a blade on the right, and a fishing weight at the top. But the reason I named them the Peat Fleet was after David Tomlin and archaeologists started talking to them and seeing that they were pulling up a lot of material off the seabed, they wanted to understand where this was really coming from. A lot of this stuff was out of context, it was ex situ, so they really wanted to get an understanding for the environments at the time. So they actually sent them out on like little campaigns to go get peat. So hence Peat Fleet. But yeah. So a lot of this work led to a really important discovery in 1999, and this was the discovery of Bouldnor Cliff by the Hampshire and White Trust for Maritime Archaeology, now known as the Maritime Archaeology Trust. And it's often joked that this was all because of one hardworking lobster, but actually a lot of work and time went into trying to find where these trawled remains were coming from. So 2 divers were sent down on a drift dive, and they actually happened to dive past a lobster who was excavating a burrow and kicking out really gorgeous worked flints into a peat, and it was excavating its burrow into a peat horizon in this underwater cliff face. So they thought, oh, this is interesting. We'd never really seen this stuff in situ before in a submerged context. So this is what started, and they started to find more and more finds in this area and started to map it a bit more. So Bouldnor Cliff is actually situated in the northwest of the Solent, and you can see it just here on the map. So you can see the north arrow is pointing towards the mainland, and we got Isle of Wight to the south, and we just got on the west of the Isle of Wight, that's where Bouldnor Cliff, that little point there. And so this is a site that's fully submerged, it's always under 11 metres of water. And they identified 5 key sites. So again, you can see with this is just showing the distribution of the 5 sites. Again, to the north, we've got the mainland, and to the south, we're going to have the Isle of Wight. But the 2 most important sites from these 5 sites that were identified is Bouldnor Cliff 5 and Bouldnor Cliff 2, because these were the sites that were producing a lot of the archaeology. So you can see on screen we've got a really nice photogrammetric model of Bouldnor Cliff 5, and you can see the peat outcropping there with the tree stumps. So we've got the cliff edge and everything there. And this was fun, because actually when I started, I did work for the Trust in the 2 years that I was before I started my PhD, and I was given the opportunity to start working on the photogrammetry models. I'd never dived the site, I'd never seen it, and it is quite abstract to think of submerged landscapes, because it's just, I think, what would you even see on the seabed? Is it just going to be, a terrestrial site but underwater? I had no idea what to expect. So I started working on these photogrammetry models, and my boss started to joke that, it would be interesting when you do dive the site to see if you can navigate your way around the site. And when it came round to it and I got to dive in Bouldnor Cliff 5, I was amazed at how much I knew the site. I knew it like the back of my hand, but the only thing that really changed was the scale. I know we have scales in these photos, you can see it on the photo there, 5 metre scale, but you don't really understand it until you see it. So that little tree stump down there, I say little, it's huge. It's bigger than me, it's 2 metres in width, and I was like, wow, I wasn't expecting it to be gargantuan. But it's an oak tree, so it's quite big. But we also have Bouldnor Cliff 2, and this is the recent photogrammetric model from this year's excavations. And you can see to the bottom part of the photo, you can see that definite line, that's representing the marine clays that have been eroding out. And what we have happening on Bouldnor Cliff 2, this is where we're getting a lot more of the lithics. So Bouldnor Cliff 5, we've got all the organics, a lot of the organics coming out of it. This is where we're getting the majority of the lithics coming. And what's happened is that coastal erosion has meant that it's eroding out the marine clays to reveal this Mesolithic sand dune that's underneath these clays. So it's much easier to erode out sand than it is clay, so you start to get this craggy deposit being formed underneath this overhang of marine clay, pulling out all the lithics. But what this also does is creates the perfect habitat for conger eels. And I'm terrified of conger eels. I see all these horrible pictures and I was terrified of seeing them. And I was assured that I wouldn't see any on Bouldnor Cliff because they only ever really are like available on shipwreck sites. So imagine my horror at 4 meters on the baseline where I saw a conger eel basically waiting to hunt, and I did this weird dance trying to get the lithics out, and it was very funny for my dive buddy Jane to watch me kind of dance to try and get the lithics without getting bitten. So it's quite funny when you start to consider that, well, we have lobsters excavating Bouldnor Cliff, but now we have conger eels protecting the site too. So now I've talked about the context of the Solent, I've also talked a bit more about the North Sea. I just wanted to talk a bit more about where my research actually fits in with the broader context. The North Sea is a great landscape, a great opportunity, but we already have a lot of people working there, and it is quite a huge area. It's about 570,000 square kilometres. So you can only imagine how kind of difficult it might be to find the archaeology. We see a lot of the large-scale mapping from the North Sea Paleo Landscape projects and the more recent calibrated survey campaigns with the Lost Frontiers project. We also have Rachel Bino's work in the North Sea off the coast of Haysborough, working on the submerged Pleistocene deposits and relating them to the onshore sites. But comparatively, the Solent is just a more pragmatic option. It's a smaller area. We have a lot more archaeology coming out of this landscape as well. So we actually have more archaeology in situ and ex situ in submerged contexts for this time period than anywhere else in the UK. We see that with the peat deposits that I was discussing, as well as the submerged forests. We also see this with the trawled remains coming from the Yarmouth fishermen. But the most important one that I just talked about was Bouldnor Cliff. Bouldnor Cliff is a really important site because it's the only known submerged in situ submerged Mesolithic site that we have in the UK. It's the only thing we really have to work with. So where I come in is that I just want to build on what we already know and use a more practical location like the Solent, where we can kind of compare the evidence that we're getting archaeologically with the geophysical stuff that we have from offshore developments, and start to really understand how they relate how to relate the onshore to the offshore record. So why am I doing this research? Well, I really want to use the current knowledge that we have of the onshore record to really start to rethink the way that we look at the Mesolithic. We have this understanding that the Mesolithic isn't as dynamic as other periods of prehistory. There isn't much going on. We don't have a lot of art coming out of it, but that's not necessarily that we don't have art, we just haven't found anything like that. So there's always this kind of idea that the Mesolithic is a bit more sterile, you know, it's not much going on, it's all about surviving. But actually I want to not only look at new sites, but I need to understand what's really gone wrong with the interpretations onshore, what's wrong with the current understandings, and can this be patched up by the input that we get from the offshore record? Will this actually change anything? Because the ultimate goal of all of my work is to find out about the lifeways of these people. It's not about how did they survive in this landscape, how much did the sea level rise, etc. Those are important parts. They are part and parcel of everything that's happening, but I'm an archaeologist. I'm looking at people, and it would be lovely to start to understand the social dynamics of these groups in a much more meaningful way. Because it is about climate change, there will be a level of understanding how these changing landscapes may have actually affected the way that they adapted in even later prehistory. So how it would have affected the shaping of these societies on the south coast of Britain. Did it change anything, or do we still see, the normal level of evolution, social evolution that we see, or did this actually, propel something new or create a new dynamic? But really, we know that this has potential. I've talked a lot about the potential. I've talked about what it can give us in terms of organic preservation, what it can tell us about prehistory and transforming the understanding of that. But we need to move away from that now. It's only well and good to have that potential, but it's a finite resource. We have coastal erosion. I've talked about that a bit. We need active investigation to move us away from the same conversations that we've been having for the last 100 years or so. So how will I do this in my PhD? So the first thing I have been doing, and I have been doing for the last year, is I need to really get to a point of having a comprehensive audit and gap analysis of the available records. So looking at the archaeological based records, more like the historical environmental records or the NRHE, also looking at the work that Citizen's doing with their coastal maps, as well as MAT, the work that's already been done at Bouldnor Cliff, looking at the material archives as well that we see in the museums. But it's not just about the archaeological records. To get to a point of pinpointing which areas will be best to investigate, to target, I need to have an understanding of the patterns and processes of geology or environmental archaeology, the environmental archaeology, paleoenvironment and things like that, but also the geomorphology and hydrodynamic processes that are happening in the offshore zone. Because this will really help me start to characterize the record in a more detailed way. I can start to look at, we know that certain deposits preserve certain types of archaeology, so there's certain deposits that will preserve organic material. So if I see that there's maybe a pattern in the archaeological record with things that we find, I can see if there's any correlation with kind of geology that it's based in. That means that I could start looking at areas maybe that we haven't found archaeology but having similar geological deposits. That's only one example. It'll be more nuanced. There will be other things influencing those decisions as well. But all of this will really get me to a point of starting to establish these areas so that we can start to target these for survey and field work, not just in the areas of seabed in the offshore zone, but looking intertidally as well, and then relating that to the onshore record. Because we still don't really have an understanding of this kind of like seamless what's going on. We know that these landscapes were terrestrial and they would have been linked to the current, the landscape that are above the waterline now, but there hasn't been really a lot to resolve how they relate to each other in a more meaningful way for archaeology, for understanding how people would have used these landscapes. So to summarise, submerged landscapes are hugely important areas for our understanding of prehistory. A lot of these landscapes that we're dealing with that are now submerged would have been the lowland landscapes. So the current coastline that we have of Britain today, that would have been considered more of the uplands. So we have the onshore record that tells us about these environments that we have onshore with the upland landscapes. We can see kind of what's happening in the record. With the limited record that we have, we can see how they interact and engage with their landscapes in this context, but we are lacking in Britain more of that understanding of the lowland regions. We do have that more in the coastal areas, but again, if you consider the large amounts that were lost under the water, you can only start to imagine just how much we can learn from looking at these places. We can no longer be talking only of potential. This is a finite resource and coastal erosion is not stopping. In fact, with current climate change, it's increasing. So we see this on Bouldnor Cliff. You can see the erosion happening on Bouldnor Cliff, and that's a known site. So you can only start to wonder what's going to be happening to the sites that we don't know about yet. How much archaeology have we already lost, and how much will we continue to use? So this is why we need to start to take an active approach to this investigation. We need to start looking for these sites in order to understand them, in order to know more about the period onshore and offshore. And we really need that regional approach because we have broader perspectives of the Mesolithic for Britain. Because we have such little finds, it's a broader understanding of what was going on, but we don't really have a local, regional approach, particularly in the Solent region, in the way that we need it to happen. So doing it in the ways that I've mentioned, not just looking at the archaeology, but also trying to understand the geology, the geomorphology, etc. And Bouldnor Cliff is one of the sites that has shown us how possible this really is. It's the only known submerged site for Mesolithic period in the UK. So we need to start looking now before all of this is lost. So this is what I'm really trying to do with my research. I want to build on the important work that's already being done with the Maritime Archaeology Trust to get us to a point of, critically analysing the record and generating new data to move us past that point. of just potential. Thank you for listening to my talk, and I hope that all made sense. If you are interested in learning more about Bouldnor Cliff or intertidal sites, please do check out resources from the Maritime Archaeology Trust on their website, or even check out the Citizen Coastal Map. Yeah, thank you.